The Sylvester Stallone of 1971 was yet to become the Sylvester Stallone of today. He was yet to become Rocky Balboa, and he was yet to become the A-list actor, inspiration to a global and devoted fanbase, the self-made cultural phenomenon, the Oscar-nominated writer, director, and producer of some of action cinema's golden age. Stallone of 71 had so far only appeared on stage and briefly in low-budget and independent films, accepting anything that came his way to hopefully establish himself as a working actor with credits and for the chance to create potential contacts and opportunities. Back then, as a young artist, Stallone was hustling by day and writing by night. Stallone had a pocket full of dreams, a head full of ideas, and would make a life-altering decision. The decision to write screenplays and to create roles for himself in absence of any serious offers. Stallone worked all sorts of jobs to make ends meet. He cleaned up lions' cages at the Central Park Zoo and ushered at the Baronet and Coronet movie theaters. Stallone would now approach the task at hand the way that a general prepares for war. If roles weren't going to be heading his way, then he would sit at his typewriter and type out his own words, his own characters, and heck, since we're dreaming big and aiming high, why not direct them too? Stallone, the writer, would embark on an intense, regimented, and systematic mission to construct screenplay after screenplay, idea after idea, story after story. If one doesn't sell, maybe the next one will. Behind the closed doors of a small apartment, Stallone produced work in a driven phase of artistic, workaholic frenzy, compelled to create something out of nothing. During these lean years, typing by candlelight deep into the night, feverishly finishing one script after another, in what was arguably one of Stallone's most creative, proactive, and hungry periods, the young hopeful emerged with several screenplays, including The Monster of Manchester, Heart to Heart, The Ballad of Butcher Bloom, and Hell's Kitchen. Stallone was determined to take control of his own future and to not end up, as he says, like just another bum from the neighborhood. The script that Stallone took to heart was a potential biopic of the iconic writer Mr. Edgar Allan Poe. The script had poured out of Stallone, and a cinematic retelling of Edgar Allan Poe's brief yet influential life became a passion project for the then 23-year-old, seeing the script as a vehicle for himself to both direct and star. Stallone would, upon reading and rereading Poe's completed works, say Poe is without doubt his favorite writer of all time. Stallone would fund his own costume tests. He posted his photographs online, some 46 years after it was originally taken, saying, "The first serious screenplay I ever wrote was about the great writer Edgar Allan Poe. At one time I had aspirations to play him, and this was part of the costume design, but I realized I wasn't really right for the part, so this is all that remains. Maybe someday I'll direct, who knows?" Posing alongside then-wife Sasha, in character as Virginia Poe, these pictures were taken early one morning in Bloomingdale's. Stallone now had a completed script, focus, and a vision that the film would start production as soon as possible. The name Edgar Allan Poe brings to mind images of lost souls' silhouettes against full moons, of haunted madmen wearing their broken hearts on their sleeves, of sorrow, melancholy, fear, paranoia, terror, yearning, and insanity as we witness premature burials against the shadowy backdrop of dusty, deserted mansions. The author of this imagery was born Edgar Poe in Boston, Massachusetts, the child of struggling actors on the 19th of January, 1809. Before he had reached the age of 3, his English mother had died, and his American father had simply disappeared, a pattern of abandonment that recurred throughout a life that was scarred with tragedy, but also marked by an extraordinary literary productivity. Working as a writer of short stories, as a poet, a critic, a harsh one at that, and as an editor, Poe is famous for his cultivation of mystery and the macabre. His tale, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, from 1841, initiated the modern detective story. Poe practically invented the haunted house subgenre, and the atmosphere in his tales of horror is unrivaled in American fiction. Poe's world would collide with Andrew Jackson's America, a world of banking collapse, financial panic, and grinding depression that had a particularly devastating effect on the publishing industry. All in all, from 14 years of professional writing, it was estimated that Poe earned approximately $6,200. His poem The Raven from 1845 numbers among the best-known work in the national literature, a poetic masterpiece that carefully catalogues the descent into darkness of a young man mourning the death of his one true love. Poe's writing reflects the madness of eternal devotion, melancholic sadness, and true grief. Edgar Allan Poe passed away, shattered in mind and body. The exact cause remains a mystery. Alcohol abuse was rumored as the cause, as was the possibility of tuberculosis, epilepsy, or diabetes. A strong theory suggests that Edgar was picked up in town and plied with alcohol and opium in a practice known at the time as cooping, in which a vulnerable adult would in effect be snatched from the street and forced to go on from one polling station to another, voting over and over again. Their clothing was changed a number of times, and they were sent out on more rounds of voting, after having first been stupefied. What is known is that Edgar was found lying in the street, close to a polling station. He was dressed differently than usual, wearing rural clothing and a straw hat that didn't belong to him. At least one Poe scholar has dismissed the idea that Poe was the victim of a political gang as nonsense. But researchers have established that cooping was a recognized political trick in Baltimore in 1849. There seems to have been particular concern about voting in the 4th Ward, precisely where Poe was found on that fateful election day. Only 7 people attended Poe's funeral, and yet more people than this had eagerly removed clumps of Poe's hair to keep as a ghoulish souvenir as the writer had lay in wait. Days after Poe's death, his literary rival, Rufus Griswold, wrote a libelous obituary of the author in a misguided attempt at revenge for some of the offensive things he felt Poe had said and written about him. Griswold penned words of bitterness perhaps unique in the history of obituaries. Edgar Allan Poe is dead. He died in Baltimore the day before yesterday. This announcement will startle many, but few will be grieved by it. Afraid of retaliation, Griswold signed the article Ludwig, but his dislike of Poe was well known, and he was quickly exposed. Griswold followed the obituary with a memoir in which he portrayed Poe as a drunken, womanizing madman with no morals, no talents, no ethics, and no friends. Griswold's attacks were meant to cause the public to dismiss Poe and his works. But the biography had exactly the opposite effect, and instead drove the sales of Poe's books higher than they had ever been during the author's lifetime. Griswold's distorted image created the Edgar Allan Poe legend that lives to this day. Griswold is now only remembered, if at all, as the guy who jealously vilified Poe's memory. Edgar Allan Poe, even in death, was unable to rest in peace. In 1976, during the press tour of Rocky, Stallone was asked of his immediate plans. Stallone said he had a trilogy in mind for Rocky. In Part 2, Rocky would go to night school and enter politics and eventually become mayor of Philadelphia. And in Part 3, he would be framed by the political machine because he was too honest, impeached, and would wind up back in the ring at 37, broken down but happy. Stallone was also reported as eager to play the starring role in the upcoming Superman motion picture. And then after that, he intended to make a film about Edgar Allan Poe, in which the author would be portrayed not as a dour dipsomaniac, but as a rogue, a real rake. In 1981, Stallone was seen with the book No One Here Gets Out Alive, the unauthorized biography of Jim Morrison's life. What do you think of that book? Stallone was asked. He said, fascinating, badly written, but a fascinating character. Morrison reminds me of Edgar Allan Poe. I've always wanted to make a movie about Poe. Morrison seems like the same tragic poet. Are you going to do a film about Jim Morrison? Stallone was asked. Someone sent me a treatment last week, so I got the book to read. I think it would be a smash movie. Newsweek, reporting on Stallone's success with Rocky, stated that the actor's ongoing pet project was a film biography of Edgar Allan Poe. "I'm a student of his," Stallone told them. But people have this image of Poe as a crazy alcoholic and drug addict, and that's wrong. I'd like to set the record straight. Stallone would tell People magazine the following month, "I can identify with Poe's tragic loss of people, his drive and his loneliness." Stallone says he admires the poet most because he never gave in.
Favorite book?
I'm a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe, so I would have to say the annotated stories of Edgar Allan Poe.
You want to play Poe, don't you?
No. I want to direct Poe.
You want to put up the direct
Yo, Poe, how you doing? Stop working. Yeah. You can't do it. Where's my quill? You know what I mean? Come on. See,
you can do it. I'm faith in you.
Right. He fought his way through the classics. He knocked out Charles Dickens, and he's back.
Favorite actor?
The 1990s came and went. Stallone starred in many movies that opened to varying degrees of success. However, audiences would still not see the actor take to the director's chair to bring Poe to screen. As we entered the 2000s, Stallone was getting older, still vowing to complete his latest draft of the Poe script. And bearing in mind that Poe passed away at a young age, the idea now was that Stallone would pass the part over to another actor and continue to tinker with the script in the meantime. To give you a brief idea of how Stallone would treat the subject matter, the script fades in on a nightmarish vision as a weakened Poe foresees his own death and burial plot. With a flash of lightning that cracks open the night sky, we are taken back to the past. We're in a military court and we meet a younger, jinxed and unblessed Edgar talking back to his superiors. Edgar is the sharp wit, full of grand ideas. He doesn't willingly embrace the notion of authority and is soon out of uniform and looking to reconcile with his former sweetheart, Sarah. Life, however, had moved on in Edgar's absence, and Sarah was now engaged to be married to somebody else. A disheartened Poe then walks straight into further rejection from his stepfather, John Allan. We see each night as Poe's perspective dissolves and crossfades into the realms of imagination and half-lit dreamscapes. The line that divides reality from fantasy is stretched to breaking point. Poe writes as fast as he can think, with quill and inkwell, zoned out in a far-off opium haze, projecting his ideas outward, until he lives and experiences his own conjured storylines, uncertain what is real and what is only a dream, as he sits surrounded by ghostly apparitions. Stallone's script tells the life of Poe in a way that would be visually mesmerizing, inventive, and true to the spirit of Poe's work. As an ongoing work-in-progress passion project, it would be unfair to spoil the plot beats and to tell how Stallone presents the telling of Mr. Poe's life, but it's true to say that Stallone has written a very poetic, lyrical, and brilliant take on the gifted, yet tormented and seemingly doomed writer. When pitching the idea to financiers and producers, Stallone's toughest opponent was now the concept of typecasting and the baggage it attaches to an actor who's looking to branch out into the previously unexplored areas of dramatic or comedic performance. Sniggering articles like "Yo Poe" were released. The author of the piece was so pleased with his own work that he would string together his own newspaper articles and release them as a book with the same title. Stallone's response to this article was good-natured enough. The jokes about the time Edgar Allan Poe infiltrated an enemy camp and used his ruthless combat skills to exact revenge in a deadly journey of vengeance seemed to write themselves, and would do the rounds in editorials and film magazines whenever the topic of Stallone's Poe arose. "Whatever next?" cried one outraged TV Guide columnist. "Schwarzenegger does Shakespeare?" Robert Downey Jr., promoting the movie A Scanner Darkly, was asked if the breaking news rumors about him playing Poe in a Stallone movie were accurate. Downey responded, "He wrote a great script. He said I should wait until I'm hot again. We should wait until you're hot again so we can do this at a big studio. I don't want to do this cheap, he said. Stallone said that? Asked the interviewer. Downey replied, yeah. The interviewer shook his head. Wait, Stallone said he wanted to wait until you were hot again. Downey laughed, saying, well, maybe he meant we. He's a great guy, really smart. In a 2006 question and answer session with his fans, Stallone was asked, is there any truth the rumors that the Poe script was sent to Stanley Kubrick? Stallone responded, let the truth be known, I sent the Poe script to Kubrick, Bob Fosse, William Friedkin, Roman Polanski, and everyone else who was a giant at the time. Some feedback was positive, but not much happened after that. So I continued to whittle away at the project, trying to find a delineation between providing a visually interesting story, his surreal stories being projected on screen, whilst maintaining a navigation through his well-documented life. I don't have any plans to be in it, but I would love to find a great talent to play Poe, because I think it will be a fantastic tour de force for a young actor. Stallone was asked what was initial inspiration for considering Edgar Allan Poe as a subject for a film. He answered, I was introduced to Poe by accident. I was basically broke and freezing in New York in January of 1970 and decided to seek some shelter and heat in the New York Public Library, which is a citadel of extraordinary books. I struck up a conversation with the guard, who said I should go to the basement and check out the archives. I did, and seeing the actual writing of Poe really caught my imagination, because the way he would write would be to split the page down the middle and glue it in one long strip so he could get more words on the page. Everything about him was unique. So I thought that he represented the heart and soul of what it's like to be a struggling artist who is ahead of his time. I was thinking of Robert Downey Jr., who would be wonderful, but so would several other young actors.
Writing, I almost approach it like exercise. I get up maybe at 4:30 in the morning, it takes an hour to get going, and then I'll start to write about maybe 3 hours. And then it becomes repetitive. And the next day I get up, and even if I don't feel inspired, I'll sit there for those 3 hours until the brain says, okay, you must start to produce something. So I try to write quickly, and I follow a pattern, just the way you would be if you were in the army or whatever. And then that gets me through it quickly. Some writers will take a year, 2 years. Everyone has a different process, but that's what I do. I literally
write better in the morning, like
most
great writers.
I used to write at night all the time but I found that everyone died. It was dark. It was creepy. It was really horrible. It was like very depressing. Then I realized Edgar Allan Poe used to write at night. Now I figure out why.
But just before we have the next question, it reminds me, your first writing was about your hero, Edgar Allan Poe.
Edgar Poe.
And how come it's taken till 2009 to get a project really close to
I know,
the screen?
Because nobody wants to do it. That's why.
And yet they've done all his stories.
I know, and no one cares about the fellow who actually wrote the stories. And at one time I wanted to do it, but I'm really not right for the part. And Sean Penn would have been great, Johnny Depp would have been great, Terrence Stamp would have been great back in the day. Yeah. I mean, it really was. So they promised me, after the next film or 2 films, I can do it. We'll do it for no money, probably maybe $12 million, and I'll have to shoot it like in Bulgaria somewhere. But I'm going to do it.
Okay, great.
And it'll be a disaster, but at least I did it. You know, it's like whew, you walk around with something for 38 years. I wrote it 38 years ago.
What fascinates you about him?
It was the first time. Every screenplay I was writing about was about me, about what I did, about going to school. You know, it was like very limited. And one day I was caught in the rain. I went into the library and I just started going through books, and I came across this book, Edgar Allan Poe, and I started to go through it, and I said, God, this is every struggling young artist. It's the same story. Obviously, he's much more brilliant than I would ever be, but it's the same thing of being ahead of your time. And I said, damn, that is timeless.
Yeah.
It's a timeless story. So that's why I wanted to.
You identified with him.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, and I think every young artist, everyone who has a different vision, has a piece of Poe in him. Yeah. And you know, you're going to be criticized. People hate change. Really, they say, "Oh, why don't you change?" Like in acting, they go, "Why doesn't he play something different?" So I do a comedy, go, "Oh, it stinks. Why doesn't he go back to what he used to do?" You're like, make up your mind. Yeah. Anyway, we all have something that we do special. You just got to stay with it.
Another fan asked, For many Edgar Allan Poe fans, the thought of you directing, let alone writing a film based on such a prolific writer is, to say the least, a little scary. That's not because we feel you're a bad writer or director, but this type of biopic is a far cry from anything that you have ever involved yourself with before. How did you approach the screenplay, structure, character development, etc.? And in what ways will this project differ from the more action-based movies you have written? Would you be upset if I called the movie Yo Poe? Just kidding. Poe is a very serious subject, and no matter how it's made, people will be offended, or at least Poe scholars will. I try to humanize Edgar, or Eddie, as he was called by his friends, to a fella who has everyday problems that are relatable to the audience, but I also spend a great deal of time dwelling on his stories, which illuminate his genius and his internal chaos. Stallone responded to another fan, saying, "The way I approach Poe is as a man who has an exuberance for life, which I believe all young artists do, whether they admit it or not, and how being so overly creative in such a provincial time in Americans' literary development caused him to be shunned and branded an eccentric. This, coupled with his own personal tragedies, demons, spun his life out of control." When asked about his ideas regarding the cinematography, textures and shots for Poe, Stallone answered, "For Poe, I'd like to focus on a muted coloured texture for the present-day scenes, and when we delve into the recesses of his mind, which I will do quite often to see the creations of his extraordinary stories as they unfold in his subconscious, they will be portrayed in muted colours and with vivid contrast. The whole point is to show Poe as a normal, struggling artist who had highs and lows like all of us, and not portrayed, as he usually is, as a somber, morbid, introverted alcoholic with flashes of brilliance." Soon after, the new rumour was that Viggo Mortensen had been offered the title role. Mortensen was said to have requested a slight script change. According to an alleged anonymous Hollywood source, Clifton Collins Jr., recently cast in Star Trek, and John Hawkes are being considered as backup options for the role. Production and financing was said to have been finally secured with Avi Lerner's Millennium and New Image Films. Shooting was to begin in May 2007 for a Christmas release. In an interview with Empire magazine in October 2009, Stallone said, "I keep telling my producer Avi Lerner, make Edgar Allan Poe. He says, does he have a gun? No, he doesn't have a gun. Can he throw a knife? I say, no, he writes poetry. I'm not playing Poe. It won't work. It'll be some young actor because he dies. But it's gonna happen."
Are you gonna do Poe, you think? That one's been out there for so long.
I will direct it, but it's never gonna live up to the hype. No matter what I do, it's gonna bomb. No. Totally. Yeah, totally. When you've been talking about something for 30 years, it's impossible. You know
I want to see it, man.
Yeah, okay.
Do you have in mind an actor? I know Downey was attached for a long while.
Yeah, it has to be like Downey, or design it for Downey, perhaps rework the script. But it needs Johnny Depp. It needs a very special actor like that. And I'm sure there's some on the horizon.
1 year later, at an audience with Sylvester Stallone in London, Stallone was asked for an update on the status on the cancelled project. "I know that it's not going to work unless it's a different thing," he told the audience. "Unless there's a hook to it. Like what they do with Sherlock Holmes, for example. I can't do that. There are too many Poe scholars that would go berserk if you tamper with it. Actors, artists, they have two faces. The public face and the private face. He's a young, goofy artist, so I try to write him as one of us, who happen to have this amazing ability. I'm still debating whether I should do it, but I know in my heart of hearts that ship has sailed." Peace FM posted a piece about Stallone and his long-time dream to make a movie about Edgar Allan Poe. Stallone gave brief comment, saying, "I do have a script that's gone through 20 mutations. Every few years I take it out and rework and update it. What fascinates me about Poe is that he was such an iconoclast. It's a story for every young man or woman who sees themselves as a bit of an outside the box or has been ostracized during their life as an oddball or too eccentric. It didn't work for him either." When Stallone received the Hollywood Reporter's Key Art Visionary Award, he was asked, "What's going on with another project of yours, Poe? The script has quite a reputation." Stallone replied, "I don't know. How could I ever live up to that rep? There's been so much talk about it that no matter what I do, it'll be anticlimactic. I don't know how I could pretend Poe, especially in today's marketplace, where getting financing for a biography would be almost impossible unless you've got a Johnny Depp or maybe Robert Downey Jr. Otherwise, there are no takers for it. I see it as a very visual film. I also see it as a film where you get into his mind. A lot of the film is actually depictions of his classic horror stories, so you've got that going for it. Stallone was interviewed in depth for the June 2010 issue of Creative Screenwriting magazine. He was asked about a Poe project listed as in the works on Stallone's IMDb page. Stallone responded, "Yeah, I'm really worried about doing it though, because I've been talking about this since 1976. Every 5 years I'll look at it and say, boy, it's sort of dated. Even though it's a period piece, the writing styles have changed so much and the audience's way of perceiving films is not the way it was in the 30s, 40s and 50s. A Line in Winter is one of my favourite films, but it's all dialogue. It's incredible dialogue, but that school of acting has fallen by the wayside. Now you have to think visually too, and that diminishes the amount of dialogue. For example, the inner workings of Poe's mind. We now get into his subconscious and you actually see his great gothic stories unfolding in front of you. You take a journey through his mind at certain points in his mind and see the black cat. You see where it came from. The interviewer followed up by asking whether or not he had learned anything about screenwriting that he really wished he'd known back when he sat down to work on Poe for the first time. Stallone answered, "I believe that your first instincts, when you write with passion, are usually the best. Quite often, in multiple rewrites, you become a little too slick, if you know what I mean. You become a bit too polished and predictable. When I was writing Rocky, I just let it go. For example, the speech from Rocky Balboa with his son. I wrote that whilst I was riding in the backseat of a car, just bouncing around. One take, one time. It was just writing from the heart rather than trying to get the audience on my side, trying to manipulate the audience. I just wrote from my heart." So to answer your question, I think that what I'd learned is try to get back to writing purely with your gut more than your brain. And that brings us up to present day. Stallone's passion project remains, as of yet, unfilmed. New drafts continue to be written as the quest for the perfect angle and the perfect timing becomes a moving target that never stands still. I personally would love to see the end product. Should Stallone finally decide enough is enough, and that the time is now to secure funding, begin pre-production, cast the roles, scout locations, and finally yell, action. This video began with the assertion that the Sylvester Stallone of today is not the Sylvester Stallone of 1971. However, after hearing Stallone speak about one unrealized project that remains dearest to him, it would be fair to revise that assumption and safely say that, at heart, Stallone is exactly the same person as he always was. As things stand, nobody knows what will happen, but thankfully Stallone is yet to say nevermore to his long-cherished work. One explanation for his long, unfruitful, almost 50-year journey of Stallone's Poe can be summed up quite elegantly in words of Edgar Allan Poe himself, when he wrote, "The true genius shudders at incompleteness, and usually prefers silence to saying something which is not everything it should be." Thanks for listening.
Changed my life because this is when I really got serious about writing, which eventually led to my whole life changing. But it's a never-ending journey, and I would hate myself if I don't continue it at least to the best of my ability and try to see it actually come to fruition. To be able to go out there and say, I accomplished it. It may have taken 45 or 50 years, but it's done. Anyway, that's what I'm working on, and it's been one of the great challenges of my life. But like Poe used to say, I promise to take this life by the throat, and I shall not let go until I succeed. Yo, Poe, keep punching.